Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I am the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. Today, we're going to look at the very first part of managing corporate cybersecurity risk. So what are you going to learn today? We're going to take a look at key documents for aligning cybersecurity risk with the business and vice versa. We'll take a look at the importance of policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. Look at how you can create alignment between the qualitative and quantitative risk assessments. And I think that's another incredibly important. We'll take a look at the risk tolerance and appetite and some of the other key business processes that are important for this. So let's go ahead and go on. So the agenda today is business alignment and Cyvergence services. That's it. So a bit of housekeeping. I assume you're familiar with the basic concepts of risk or have watched the basics of cybersecurity risk assessments, which is the first part of this series. There are several examples that are used in this presentation. All of them are purely fictitious and don't represent any company. I just want to be very clear about that because this is all fictitious information, and I've never seen a company that matches anything that I'm going to bring up here today. I do assume that some of the subjects you're familiar with, but they may be the subject of future presentations, but I haven't done that. But I'm going to assume that you've got some general overall knowledge. So just a little bit of background as you start to approach this. So let's jump into business alignment. For me, one of the most important things when you're jumping into a company is policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. You've got to have some sort of process for how you do something. The policy is why are you doing it? You know, do you follow compliance? Do you do it specifically for risk reasons? Do you do it for alignment reasons? There's a lot of different things, reasons why you might have a policy, but the policy is going to answer why. A standard is going to be the what. What are the requirements for performing the risk assessment? How often do you have to do them? What is the level of depth? What are the types that you can have? Because there's a lot of different types of risk assessments that you can do. But it's also about the procedures. You know, how do you perform the risk assessments? So these kind of details are very important. Now, in some cases, you might be better off creating guidelines or guardrails for how you do something. And so you're not going to necessarily follow a process. And as you start to mature, you might decide to start turning these things into standards over a period of time once you determine what's going on. And that's a very normal process within organizations. So risk appetite and risk tolerance are one of those foundational concepts for anybody who's going to be jumping into performing risk assessments. You know, how much risk is acceptable to the business? So you might break them down, like over in the example that I have over on the right-hand side is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality could be up to high. So maybe they're okay with accepting a lot of risk from a confidentiality perspective. Integrity, up to moderate level risk they'll accept. And availability, you know, that's a whole nother thing. They'll accept only up to low risk. So availability is really important for this particular company. You know, what the details are going to be completely dependent on what kind of company you have and what that organization is. So this is one of the ways that we can start to create that alignment. There, you know, other considerations you can add in like reputation, or I've seen a lot of unique little processes that are added in. But typically, if you cover CIA and reputation, you know, I would say, you know, 60% of the companies you're going to be covered and you're going to be just fine looking at it from that standpoint. Now, risk tolerance is how much deviation from the risk appetite. So let's say the availability up to low, but they'll accept, you know, one level of deviation difference. They'll accept it up to a moderate risk for a deviation for a period of time. But this just lets you know how tolerant is that organization. You know, things don't have to be perfect. Things are never perfect, but it's what's going to be reasonable from a business standpoint. And you might consider other categories as well. So the other thing I would look at is what are the other key concerns of the business? Now that goes into, you know, CIA and reputation because that's part of it. And so you want to be very open to what they care about and include that in the risk appetite or the risk tolerance process, and just to factor that in as appropriate to your organization. Another thing that I think is very important to do is have a business impact assessment. If you have one available, it is a gold mine of information because it's going to tell you exactly how the business feels about things. Now, these are very important for disaster recovery plans, and we are going to touch on the disaster recovery plans in a little bit. But, you know, here's a hypothetical, purely fictitious example of something that you might do from a BIA perspective, business impact assessment perspective. So you might find that for an email, business unit one, it can be down for an hour, it's $500. It's really not a big deal. It could be even less than 500. Business unit two, for example, might say, well, this we absolutely are critical. We could lose $2 million an hour for this, or minimal, it's going to be $10,000 an hour, from a business unit perspective. So all of these things are going to be very different in their approaches. You can see here that the alignments are very different. You've got different approaches that you're taking, and there's a lot of different systems that I posted here. You could have like a list of 100 different capabilities that you're looking at and analyzing across the business units. Some of them, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. Others are going to be very much dependent upon it. So you see here with business unit two and e-commerce site one, it's not an impact. They don't really care about it for that particular business unit. They're primarily focused on the commercial website, and email systems are the key things that they pay attention to with their laptops. You could kind of take a look at that and get some additional detail behind the capability. This is here only for illustrative purposes to get you the idea of why this can be so valuable when you're performing a risk assessment. And it can help you with your risk assessment to make sure that you're in line with what the business thinks. And you could say, well, we've noted that if your email goes down and you don't have a backup for it, that business unit two is greatly affected by it. That could be a pretty critical risk for the organization, depending on the risk appetite and risk tolerance. So let's go into qualitative and quantitative alignment. So there's qualitative risk assessments and quantitative risk assessments, which I've talked about before. Qualitative is where you have the minimal, low, moderate, high, critical. The quantitative is getting down to a number, a dollar figure for what the impact is going to be from a business perspective. So what you're going to find, and I've been a global CISO and have focused on this from multiple standpoints, is that different organizations will have a different assessment. You may even find that they're different within an organization. Maybe they've got all these different business units, and maybe they're focused on somewhat of the same thing, but maybe from a different angle. So that's very common in organizations, but it helps to give you an idea. How do people feel about things? What is the real risk? If they lost $500, is that a big deal or is it not a big deal? This sort of process may be completely absurd for some organizations, but not absurd for others. So you really want to take a look at this and go, what's really going on here? And what's interesting, especially when you've got other companies and you're assessing them, you can see that there's a vastly different definition of things. So when you're walking in and getting the qualitative or quantitative assessment, you want to define, what does that mean? What is a critical assessment? Is that critical assessment going to be something that's could take the whole business down? Maybe $50,000 for business unit one would just eliminate that whole business unit. But the business as a whole says, you know what, we don't care. We'll go ahead and cover the 50,000. We'll make it flush again, which could start to change how they approach things. So these things can be very different for organizations, but it's just something to take into account. But this starts to show you why things are so important, because it gives you an idea of perspective for that part of the organization. There are a lot of other business alignment considerations to take into account as well. I like to look at things like charters if they exist. Do you have a risk program? When you're starting to build a program, do they have a charter? If they do, what's in the charter? What are the details behind it? What are the goals of it? Is the goal to bring things down from a moderate risk or lower? Maybe it's for low risk. They'll get rid of everything like in the critical, high, and moderate level. You can take a look at things like the risk tolerance and appetite, the BIAs I spoke about. But the other things that I really want to dive into are the disaster recovery plan, the incident response plan, key business dependencies, and crown jewels. Now, the only one that's not going, don't go into a lot of details in, is the key business dependencies. Now, the key business dependencies are important. So take something like Change Healthcare. They had a breach, they were unavailable for quite a while. And what happens in that particular case, businesses were not able to function. They were not able to collect the payments and do things that they needed to do to have a normal organization functioning. So that's something that's important, to take a look at those key dependencies and see how they relate to it. And that will help to inform what you're doing from a risk assessment process. So that's really critical. But let's go ahead and go in a little bit further and take a look at some of this other stuff. So the disaster recovery plan, there's a lot that can go into it. This is highly simplifying things. I'm painfully aware of that. But you consider things like the maximum tolerable downtime. The business says we can only accept, things being down for a 2-hour window. Great. That tells you what's the risk. And change healthcare, you thought, well, it's unlikely, but it could happen. It did happen. So making sure that you've got a backup in place is something important, especially if you've got a very small window of something being down. Other things are recovery point objective. What systems actually need to be up and running from the BIA to make sure that things are running properly for the organization? There's recovery time objective. This is when you want to make sure that things are up by. So that's a recovery time objective. Maybe things need to be up and running in 4 hours, but maybe there's a bunch of different systems and they're applied to in a different way. This can be a pretty complex uh, process for your organization, or it could be very simple. It just depends on the organization. You have to sit down and think about those things. But then you take a look at mean time to recover. Maybe the mean time to recover is not in alignment with the BIA. Maybe the things need to be recovered from a maximum tolerable downtime perspective of 2 hours, but the mean time to recover is 3 days when you actually do the testing. And things like that, when you go through and do the testing, are not uncommon. So you want to make sure that things are running properly within your organization, but it can really start to give you a clue. And so when you're looking through these things, you can sometimes find evidence in there that shows information that you may not immediately be aware of, but can give you a clue, and that can help with your governance process from a cybersecurity perspective and a risk perspective. I also think that incident response is very interesting because there might be different levels of people that you need to let know, especially the larger the organization. Like, for example, many security people are going to have a knee-jerk reaction and say, oh, data exfiltration must be critical. Well, maybe or maybe not. If you lose one record, is that critical? No, it might look bad, but usually things like that, you have a reporting threshold that you have to report data being lost. So one data point being lost, it's probably not that big of a deal, um, if you consider that. So, this is not something like you had a massive failure. You handed somebody the wrong information. It's data exfiltration, but is it really critical? So you could start to be very detailed in what these processes are and saying, hey, is this right for the organization? So I do think that when you take a look at this, if you've got a healthy incident response program, you've got the business integrated with it, you can have a much better sense of what's going on. But they are very enlightening to take a look at, because are they in line with what the business is saying? And maybe there are different levels of business that you're starting to go with. And so different business units might want to look at things from a different standpoint. And how you report and who you report to could be very different depending on the context. So that's why I find the incident response plan so interesting, because it gives you yet another view as to what's going on within organizations. Now, crown jewels. So basically, what crown jewels are, the things that are so important to the organization. They are essentially the crown jewels for what it is. And the definition of that could be completely different depending on your organization. Maybe it's your secret recipe, if you happen to be developing something like that. Coca-Cola would be a good example of that. They definitely want to protect what they're doing from that perspective. They don't want their recipe to be lost, and it could be a major hit to the organization. But for some, it's going to be your data, sometimes your processes, your technology people. All of these things are perfectly reasonable to assume is part of your crown jewel analysis. So you can use crown jewel assessments. Divergence does crown jewel assessments for organizations. That's part of what we do. But taking a look at the crown jewels and seeing what they are and what is the level of importance related to crown jewels can really give you an idea as to what's going on from a process perspective within the organization, and then say, well, how is that information treated? And so this is yet another way that you can approach risk assessments. Of course, there's a lot more that's going on. We've got many more of these going on for this level, but now we're going to touch a little bit on our services. We've got risk assessments, registers, et cetera, that we're doing. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me because there's a lot we can go into. We're barely touching the surface of managing risk for an organization. But at this point, I wanted to thank you very much. If you like this video, make sure that you follow us on LinkedIn, et cetera, and we'll go from there. Well, I want to thank you very much for showing, and I appreciate your time today. Have a good day. Bye-bye.